agricultural practices. And when you hear the term good agricultural practices, it's kind of a general term, and it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people depending upon their background and their particular direction in life. And when Springfield Community Gardens asked me to do this workshop, I said, "Well, you know, what would you like to be covered in the workshop?" And they said, "Well, you know, just whatever you think would be appropriate." And so, when I think about good agricultural practices, I think about practices that promote health and safety on the farm. And we'll be talking about several different things related to health and safety on the farm. But again, there's many, many more topics that we could include under the umbrella of good agricultural practices. But here in a moment, we'll take a look at the outline of what we're going to talk about. This workshop is done in partnership with Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens is a grassroots nonprofit organization in the Springfield, Greene County area that has a vision of a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And it's a real privilege for me to be associated with Springfield Community Gardens and with their mission. Some of the projects that are of particular note with Springfield Community Gardens, first of all, of course, their network of community gardens across Springfield. Secondly, they have a beginning farmer incubator that has been a very effective way to introduce people to the opportunities that are available in farming in Southwest Missouri. And so again, I salute them for the work that they've done to help promote a healthy, locally based food system in Southwest Missouri. The activity of tonight, and in fact our workshop series as we move ahead, is funded in part through several grants through the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture has programs in place to help support profitability and sustainability among farmers, and that's farmers of all scale. The entry point to many of the services that are available from the USDA is through the Farm Services Agency, and the Farm Services Agency has offices in most counties in Missouri. And we certainly encourage anyone with an interest in these programs to reach out through their local Farm Services Agency office. Housed in the Farm Services Agency office is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is abbreviated as NRCS. NRCS has a number of programs that can be very helpful to farmers. Again, farmers of all scale, but in particular specialty crop farmers. And programs such as the High Tunnel Cost Share and programs related to agroforestry and to water, air, and soil conservation can be very helpful to farmers. Another agency of interest is the Risk Management Agency. This particular agency offers low-cost insurance programs for specialty crop farmers, and it's definitely worth looking at. And then all of these resources are described and summarized on the farmers.gov resources website. So reach out to your local Farm Services Agency to learn more about any of these programs. Our workshop tonight is going to be focused on 3 different aspects of good agricultural practices. And again, this is a little bit of an interesting collection of topics, but we'll be talking about, first of all, produce food safety. Now, we've had a number of other workshops, and we'll have more moving ahead that are focused on produce food safety, but tonight we're going to introduce some practices that can be done by anyone in a farm setting to help grow crops that are safe for the people who will be consuming those crops. Then we'll be talking about good agricultural practices as they relate to pesticide use. And when we talk about pesticides, this includes certainly organic pesticides as well as inorganic pesticides. So anyone who's using a pesticide, whether it's organic or inorganic, must be aware of how to use that product safely and how to protect themselves in the course of using that product. So we'll spend some time talking about that. And then we'll finish up with what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of our workshop tonight, and that's looking at the farmer themselves and looking at good agricultural practices as they relate to physical and mental health. And we'll have a video presentation in this area by a program called the Missouri Agribility Project. And this is a project that is devoted to making farming available and accessible to people of all ages and all abilities. And so I think that we'll find that a very interesting video. I will mention as we move ahead, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. For those who are new to Zoom presentations, chat is typically found along the bottom of your screen. There's a toolbar there, and there's a button called chat. If you click on that, that will enable you to type a question into the chat. Of course, we're a small group tonight, and so it'll be just as easy to unmute your microphones and ask questions as we go through the material. Okay, well, let's begin our discussion of good agricultural practices with produce food safety. And really, the reason that we're starting with this is that it all comes down to producing crops, right? And these crops are going to be the basis of sustainability and profitability on a farm of any size. But it's important that these crops be safe for the people who will be consuming them. Now, we'll be focused in this particular part of the presentation primarily on microbial food safety. In other words, growing crops where the risk of being developing a foodborne illness because of a biological agent is minimized. So we'll be talking about why food safety is important. We'll be talking about some of the basics of on-farm produce food safety, and we'll spend a little time talking about water testing. So again, why is food safety important? Well, again, this is a question that has an obvious answer. It's important that farmers provide products as safe as possible for the consumers who are going to enjoy those products. From the farmer's viewpoint, it's an important part of protecting markets and reducing liability. And it's just, again, if our goal as an organization, if Springfield Community Gardens' goal is to build a food system, it's important that customers have confidence in that food system. It's important that the products that our farmers grow and market are first of all of good quality, but are also safe. Okay, so again, it's important that the consumers recognize the dedication that farmers have to this. And in some cases, there are federal and state regulations in place that ensure that practices are followed to ensure that crops are safe. Another aspect that is sometimes lost in all of the regulatory discussion is that practices that promote food safety also improve quality and shelf life of products. And this, of course, has a direct bearing on the marketability and the profitability of the crops that are grown. So again, these food safety practices through things such as temperature control and sanitation can develop crops that are, first of all, better quality and crops that will last longer after harvest. Practices that help reduce water loss related to produce food safety also preserve quality, and you end up with more pounds of product to sell. And then these practices oftentimes prevent early spoilage and bad appearance. And again, a customer is less interested in a crop that just doesn't look good or that has evidence of spoilage or other problems. And this, of course, leads to lost sales and profits. So it is important that we consider produce food safety not just from the standpoint of safe products, but also from the standpoint of products that will improve sustainability and profitability for the farmer. So there's benefits on all sides. So why is foodborne illness an issue? Well, again, because it's a serious problem in this country. The Centers for Disease Control estimate that 1 in 6 people will get sick based upon something they've eaten in a given year. This is about 48 million people per year. About 128,000 of those will be hospitalized, and unfortunately, there'll be around 3,000 deaths annually from foodborne illnesses. Now, oftentimes, foodborne illness is underreported. This is because the symptoms of foodborne illness frequently are similar to those to other conditions. And so even though we have some figures here, these are underreported. That's the reality. And we also have to recognize that it's not just large-scale agriculture that can lead to issues with foodborne illness. Granted, if a farm is growing products on a large scale and distributing widely, the possibility of a widespread foodborne illness outbreak traced back to that farm is certainly there. On the other hand, though, people can get sick from the products grown and marketed by small-scale farmers. Outbreaks continue to occur. This is not something that used to happen. This is something that happens, and it's not unusual. It seems like every several months we hear another report of a foodborne illness outbreak. It certainly affects markets. We can point to long-term market changes as a result of widespread outbreaks of foodborne illness. For example, I always think about romaine lettuce now before I break open a head of romaine lettuce. And in fact, quite frankly, the market for romaine lettuce has been seriously impacted by several foodborne illness situations traced back to consumption of romaine lettuce. We also have to remember that those populations that are vulnerable to foodborne illness are actually increasing, particularly in the case of older Americans. But other groups, those who are young, those who are pregnant, and those who are sick, particularly those who are sick with illnesses that impair their immune systems, are vulnerable. And these groups tend to be be on the increase in this country. So which products have been traced back to foodborne illness? Well, this pie chart gives us an idea. This is looking at foodborne illness outbreaks that were traced back to specific commodities, specific specialty crops. And this was between 1996 and 2014. And if we look at that pie chart, we notice that nearly half of that chart is made up of just two groups of crops, sprouts and leafy greens. But we look at the other quarter there, and we can see berries, tomatoes, and melons are implicated in about a quarter of the foodborne illness outbreaks. So between those crops, that's about 3/4 of the reported foodborne illness outbreaks. But we notice that other quarter of the pie chart includes a number of different crops that have been directly implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks. So if people consume a crop raw without cooking, without a kill step, there is the possibility of that crop making them sick. But again, as we look at this pie chart, we notice that there are certain crops that have been widely implicated. And when you think about why that's the case, oftentimes it's related to some characteristic of that crop or some way in which that crop is produced. So we'll want to keep that in mind as we go through the remainder of the material in this section of today's presentation. So if we look at the big picture, and if we look at the situation with produce, and if we look at the potential sources of contamination, biological contamination on that produce, it's typically traced back to one of 5 sources. It could come from the soil, and we'll talk more about how things such as soil amendments could be a problem. It could come from water, and in fact, water has been implicated in a number of foodborne illness outbreaks. It could come from problems in buildings, equipment, or tools. We call this cross-contamination, and this cross-contamination can then spread to produce. It could come from animals themselves. It could be domestic animals, or it could be the incursions of wild animals into areas where crops are being grown or handled. But a very common source of foodborne illness is from the people who contact that produce, the people who grow the produce, who harvest it, grade it, sort it, pack it, and then send it to market. So again, any of these 5 sources could be a source for a contamination situation on the farm. Again, looking at the big picture, here would be just a kind of a graphic of a farm, and we see the farm location here, and we look around that farm and we can see how activities both on the farm and around the farm can impact produce food safety. For example, a water source. If we're drawing water from a lake or a stream, that water could be contaminated from runoff or from the activity of animals near the water. If we're growing a crop that is downhill from an area where animals are confined, perhaps we could have manure runoff or something like that from those animals or from a manure storage area. Perhaps we have animals that fly over a field and deposit manure on crops. Perhaps we have people who are ill or otherwise have their hands that are not clean that contact the crop. Again, there are lots of ways that contamination can reach produce. And when we talk about good agricultural practices, we're talking about ways that we can minimize potential routes of contamination. Now, it's important to recognize before we get into this discussion that a farm is not a sterile environment. A farm is not a laboratory. There is just no way to completely eliminate risk. But when we talk about good agricultural practices and produce food safety, we're looking at practices that minimize risk. That if practices are put into place and if they're properly implemented, it can reduce the risk of a contamination situation occurring and then people getting sick from consuming that produce. Okay, do we have any questions before we actually move into a discussion of what some of these sources of contamination might be? Any questions in the chat, Deborah?
Nope, I have no questions in the chat.
Okay, and again, I'll encourage those folks who are on the workshop, if you'd like to unmute and ask questions at any time, that would be just great. Okay, so let's start with a discussion of soil amendments. And soil amendments of animal origin, so amendments such as manures and other products such as feather meal, bone meal, blood meal, these are all amendments they're extremely valuable for specialty crop production, particularly for organic specialty crop production. They're excellent sources of nutrients and organic matter and other conditioners that help maintain soil health and promote good plant growth. But these can also be a source of contamination if they're not, first of all, treated initially, or if they're not handled properly after they've been applied to the soil. So some of the factors that can lead to problems: if an application is made too close to harvest, or if the amendment is improperly or incompletely treated. And this is particularly the case with manure. Manure by its nature is contaminated. It's coming from the digestive tract of an animal, and in most cases, animals can be carriers of the organisms that can make people sick. Improper storage, runoff, these can be problems. Wind spread can move soil amendments onto crop areas. And then cross-contamination due to improper sanitation procedures. So for example, equipment that is used to haul and spread manure, if it's then used to transport produce, can be a source of cross-contamination. Your hands, if you're applying manures and then you work with crops during harvest or post-harvest, handling your hands can become a source of cross-contamination. Your clothing, there are lots of potential sources for cross-contamination. So again, I just touched on this, but some of the sources of contamination, it can be things that happened in the past, or it could be things that are happening now. So things such as flooding can move amendments onto sites, carcasses and dump sites, septic leaks or runoff, and then particularly on farms that have both animal agriculture and produce production, it's very important to figure out the interface between the animal aspect of the farm and the produce aspect, and looking at places such as storage areas for manure, compost piles, where animals are held, where animals are moved on the farm. All of these things relative to produce, they have to be kept in mind. And so some best practices, again, some good agricultural practices: whenever possible, locate crops away from animals, away from manure, and away from compost piles, if possible upslope. But certainly do everything that you can to prevent runoff from areas where animals are located onto produce fields. If there is a concern, mediate it with ditches, berms, use buffer strips or hedgerows. Hedgerows are particularly effective against wind-blown contamination because manure can be spread by the wind as well as by physical movement or runoff. Now, it's a common practice, particularly on organic farms, to use animal-based amendments for soil fertility management. And this can be done safely and this can be done effectively, but it's important to consider the risk of contamination. And the guidelines that are in place based upon the National Organic Program standards is to allow 120 days between the application of raw manure and then harvesting the edible part of a crop, particularly crops that are going to be into contact with the soil or can be reasonably expected to be in contact with the soil. Now, there are crops that's not the case. So something such as apples, for example, or blueberries, the edible portion is not likely to come into contact with the soil. And in that case, a 90-day interval is considered to be sufficient. So again, these are two intervals to consider to help minimize the risk of contamination from manure or manure-based products. Another way to reduce the risk of contamination from an animal-based product, particularly manure, is to compost it. And during the composting process, heat is generated. And if the composting process is properly accomplished and it is carried out over a long enough period of time, that heat will render the compost microbially safe. But it's important that those conditions be met. And this can be a challenge in on-farm composting. If you are planning to on-farm compost and you're using manure as part of the raw material of the compost, it's very important to be able to validate that you're doing this process correctly. It's based upon temperatures and turning. And for more information on that, please reach out and we can discuss specifics. But you have to accomplish it properly, because if you don't, there's a good likelihood that that compost is not microbially safe. And if that's the case, it needs to be treated as manure, allowing for the 120-day or the 90-day interval between application and harvest of the crop. And then it's important to watch out for recontamination. You can have a compost pile that is microbially safe, but if you have wildlife activity or if you have domesticated animal activity in that pile, it can be recontaminated. And certainly a dog, as we see here, can be a risk, but in particular, cats can be a challenge because cats they tend to bury their manure and it can be difficult to locate. And if you have several cats using a compost pile, as a litter box, contamination is inevitable. So again, back to the compost and manure discussion. As far as good agricultural practices, the compost must be made using a scientifically valid process. It certainly can be done that way on your farm. If you're purchasing compost, it's a good practice to request a letter from your supplier, from the seller, that indicates that their process meets composting standards. That way you can use that product with assurance that it's microbially safe. Okay, any questions about compost and manure?
There's no questions in the chat.
Okay, very good. Now let's talk a bit about water. And the material that we're discussing today is taken from a training on produce food safety that is a day-long training. And we, in the course of that day-long training, we spend 2 hours on water alone. And we're going to summarize some of those points. But I'll encourage anyone who's interested in a more in-depth discussion of produce food safety to consider attending one of the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Alliance trainings. We schedule those at intervals. We have one coming up in November that'll be virtual. And if you're interested in that, please reach out and we'd be happy to add you to the attendees for that workshop. But now when we talk about agricultural water, it's important to think about how water is used in a produce operation. And based upon the usages on a farm, how can we reduce the potential for contamination from that water? And again, water is used on every produce farm in one form or another. But there are good ways, good agricultural practices that can be put into place to minimize the risk associated with that water use. So again, some of the ways that we use water, we have to recognize again that water can be a very effective agent of carrying and spreading human pathogens. Again, a small problem can very quickly become a large problem where we can see entire field contamination, or at the very least, contamination of large amounts of produce. We use water during production, for irrigation, for crop sprays, for frost protection. We use water as we harvest and handle crops. This can be used to cool crops. It's used for waxing crops. It's used for cleaning and washing crops. We also use water to wash our hands and to wash equipment in the course of producing crops. And then sometimes we have unexpected events such as flooding events or runoff events that can impact produce food safety as well. So when we think about good agricultural practices, we want to think about those practices that we can implement during production, those practices that we can implement during post-harvest handling of crops, and then how can we address unexpected events? Now, an important part of developing a strategy, a good agricultural practices approach to water, is to consider the source of the water and the potential for contamination. If we're using only public water on our farm, if that water is coming from a municipality, a county, a water authority, or some other source that is delivering that water to the farm, this is the safest water. And it's safest because that water is regularly tested and treated to address any concerns. So we can assume that when that water arrives on the farm, it is microbially safe. The next safest water source are subterranean sources coming from the ground. And here we're typically talking about wells. And a well, of course, has to be properly constructed and properly cased to maintain its quality. And it's also important that we don't assume the groundwater is safe. There are many, many instances of contaminated groundwater, and the only way to know for sure is to test that water. The third source of water is surface water, and this is water that is open to the environment. It's typically coming from a stream, a lake, or a pond. And because it is open to the environment, it is almost universally, it carries some load of contamination. And we need to add springs to this group as well. In most cases, springs carry some load of contamination unless there's some way to cap the spring and to make sure that it's not exposed to the open environment before that water is drawn off for use. So again, if we look at the spectrum from lowest risk to highest risk, it starts out with public water, then moves to groundwater, and then surface water carries the highest risk. Now, what about good agricultural practices? Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, would that include like runoff water from roofs when you try to do catchment from rain barrels?
Yes. Rainwater that is harvested, catchment water, water coming off of structures, high tunnels, etc., has been exposed to the open environment. And again, almost invariably, the surfaces from which the water is collected from have been contaminated one way or another. It could be a windblown contamination. It could be birds defecating on the surface. But as we've done many tests over the years looking at rainwater catchment, almost invariably the water carries a load of contamination.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so from the standpoint of good agricultural practices and water, the first step, of course, is to regularly test water sources. Now, municipal water, someone else is doing the testing for you. And in that case, it's just a matter of contacting whoever is delivering that water to you and requesting the results of their testing, and they're happy to send that out to you. If a farmer is using well or surface water, it's important that that water get tested. Now, we can get into some regulatory guidelines here, and certainly in the course of our produce food safety training, we spent a lot of time talking about that. But the bottom line is, from the standpoint of good agricultural practices, wells and surface water sources must be tested. Right now is a good time to test water because we have a water testing program in place for specialty crop farmers that allows for free water tests through your municipal or county health department. And again, for more information on that, please reach out, and we'll be happy to share information on how to collect and submit a water test for this free service. Post-harvest water, the water that we're going to be using once crops are harvested, must be potable water. That's water that must be drinking water quality. And if you're testing a well, for example, and it comes back with a low level of contamination, it may be allowable to use that water for irrigation, but it is not allowable to use that water for harvest and post-harvest handling of produce. That water must be drinking water quality. So again, good agricultural practices here demand that we understand water quality, and the only way to do that is to test that water. We should also think about how we're watering crops, because the less water contact we have with the harvested part of the crop, the lower the risk. And this is particularly the case if we do have water that we're using that carries some load of contamination. So when we think about irrigation strategies, overhead irrigation, yes, it's fine as long as the water quality is suitable, but we are wetting the crop. And anytime we do that, that does lead to higher risk. Trench or furrow irrigation, where we're running water alongside crops, in this case, unless there's unexpected splash from the trench or the furrow onto the crop, typically those crops that are not in contact with the soil will not come into contact with the water. The safest way is to use drip or trickle systems that are under a plastic mulch or under some other sort of mulch, where the irrigation water is separated from the above ground part of the crop. Now, if we're working with root vegetables, again, it's inevitable that those crops come into contact with the soil and with the irrigation water. So we can't take advantage of a delivery method as a good agricultural practice. But with most other crops that have above ground parts that we're going to harvest, the way that we irrigate can directly impact produce food safety. All right, do we have any questions on water before we leave that subject and talk a bit about domesticated and wild animals?
There's no questions in the chat. I didn't know that we've used something called a boogie water, something that I think it takes out maybe calcium from the water. Is there certain things that are in our filtered water that comes from the city that aren't necessarily as good to be using that we should think about filtering out, or on a large scale, is that not really applicable?
The primary concern with municipal water is generally related to the treatment of that water, which is frequently based upon chlorine. And there are certain crops that are quite sensitive to chlorine. An example would be some certain types of leafy greens, where you can actually get marginal burning on the foliage when it's exposed to water that's been treated with chlorine-based sanitizers. Most other crops, this is a very low risk. And in many cases, especially if we're using an overhead type way of irrigating, just the dispersion of the water will actually disperse any chlorine that might be present in it, so that doesn't carry much risk. Now, water that has been softened can sometimes carry, it will carry frequently a load of sodium. And over time, sodium can build up in soils if there's not an allowance for that sodium to be leached to the soil or otherwise removed from the soil profile. So particularly in high tunnels that are not exposed to rainfall, there can be issues with sodium buildup if softened water is used. But in most cases, municipal water is safe to use for crops. And again, it carries that benefit of being microbially safe as well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's talk a bit about animals now. And this could be domesticated animals that are, there at our invitation, and then wild animals. Animals can carry and transmit human pathogens. It's just a reality that oftentimes in their digestive tract, they carry organisms that are pathogenic to humans. And they can also carry these organisms on their fur, in their saliva, other parts of their bodies. And so activities such as feeding, rooting, and movement through crops can spread contamination. Animals, of course, can contaminate water sources, particularly if those water sources are directly accessible to animals and their feces. And then manure runoff from storage areas or from where animals are held into water can be a problem, or even directly onto crop fields. And so good agricultural practices demand that we look at ways to prevent this from happening. It's also important to monitor fields for the presence or the evidence of activity of animals, and then we take measures to reduce or prevent problems if we suspect that there has been intrusion or contamination. One very important thing to consider when working with crops, when harvesting crops, is never harvest produce that is visibly contaminated with feces or likely to have been contaminated. Again, many studies have shown that it's nearly impossible to clean produce up that has been visibly contaminated with feces. So if you're harvesting strawberries and you find a strawberry that has bird feces on it, you can't wipe that off on your trousers. You can't wash that off in water. Contaminated produce is contaminated produce, so that produce should not be harvested. Now, there are ways to reduce the impact of animal intrusion. In the case of domestic animals, they can be confined or they can be excluded from plantings. In the case of wild animals, they can be excluded from plantings or in some cases scared away by various types of scare tactics. And we can see several of these in this picture: the coyote decoy, the swan decoy, the owl. The lower right shows a deer exclusion fence. The upper right shows a bird exclusion netting placed over blueberries. And we have a video coming up that I'd like to show that illustrates several tactics to help manage animal intrusion. The first two tactics that the video will describe are scare tactics. The first one is the use of propane cannons, which go off at intervals and scare particularly birds away. The second tactic is a shell that is placed in a firearm and shot over a production field to scare birds primarily. And then the third discussion is just a brief discussion on raccoon management. And the speaker will be talking about trapping and relocation or lethal management, but if you look behind the speaker, you'll notice some tactics in place in the high tunnel that include an electrified fence, that include chicken wire netting, and that also include a barrier fence a little bit higher up. So let's take a look at that video, and then if we have any questions following, we can tackle them.
Handheld whistle bombs work pretty good to disperse birds when they come in large flocks. You're going to use the bird bomb pistol in order to reduce risk to yourself. Usually wear a leather glove, extend your arm the full extent, and then turn your face away from the barrel of the firearm. exclusion does not work, then go up the scale to the removal. Oftentimes you can catch raccoons in cage traps, like this trap, works very well. There are many other styles of traps out there that are specific for raccoons. And then in Kansas, we always have the option of lethal removal with the use of firearms. So those would be the techniques that I would use when considering solving raccoon problems.
Okay, do we have any questions about animals?
Patrick, I know I've been through the GAP certification class you were talking about earlier, the 2-hour-long one, and it was all day. I think you said there was 2 hours about water. But yeah, there was one part they talked about with feces, if you are growing produce near like cows and there's a cow that poops close to your produce, you have to give it like a 10-foot berth or something. So what's the berth with the smaller, like cats or dogs or that kind of thing? How much around it do you have to not harvest?
The answer to that is it depends. And that seems like a general answer to a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But when we think about a suspected situation of manure in a crop field, first of all, if we are on a farm where we have animals as well as produce present, or if our neighbor has animals, it's a good agricultural practice to maintain a buffer between the area where the animals are and the area where the produce is. You know, a buffer helps prevent unintended movement of manure from where the animals are into the produce field. So that's the first step. If we have a situation where we suspect there's manure in the field because we see evidence of animal tracks or animal activity, or you know, if we've done an examination of our crop before we harvest it, which is a really good agricultural practice, and we actually note manure, then we need to think about what part of the crop may have been contaminated. Now, that produce safety rule training that you mentioned, it doesn't really tell us what the buffer should be around an area where we suspect a manure problem. The guidance we have is 0 to 25 feet, and the actual buffer that a person should allow around an area where you see manure from a raccoon or a rabbit or deer or cows or whatever it might be is based on several things. First of all, the characteristics of the manure. You know, the manure from cows, for example, is loose and tends to move when it hits. The manure from something like a deer is drier and it's more contained. It doesn't tend to spread as much. So what I would suggest doing is to note the area where manure is visibly present, and then do a job of looking around that area, look for any additional manure, and establish a buffer zone that is based upon the realities of the manure. The other thing to take into consideration, has it rained since that manure is deposited? Is there the chance that water splash may have spread it? In most cases, a buffer zone of about 2 to 5 feet is sufficient. And generally, 2 feet in many cases is sufficient. But a farmer is expected to use their common sense to do what they can to reduce the risk of accidental contamination from manure.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Okay, well, let's talk a bit about harvesting. And in the case of harvesting crops, now we're moving into a point where it's very easy to contaminate crops if they're not handled properly. Now, the first step is the pre-harvest assessment. And this is basically a walk through the field that's going to be harvested. And what the farmer is looking for is evidence of animal intrusion. In other words, a walkthrough in the morning before we begin to harvest, we're looking for animal tracks, we're looking for visible evidence of manure, we're looking for places where crop may have been browsed. And if we see those areas, then we're going to address those particular concerns. The other thing that's very important at this stage is that everybody who's going to be out there harvesting needs to be trained in recognizing potential risks. In other words, trained to be on the lookout for manure on crops, trained to be on the lookout for animal feeding, all of these things that could impact the safety of the crop. And the more eyes you have focused on this, the better the good agricultural practice is to minimize that risk. Once the crop is harvested, then every attempt should be made to keep the produce cool or to cool it quickly after harvest. So in other words, harvest in the morning when crops are cool. This is just a good agricultural practice to maintain quality as well. So harvest in the morning when crops are cool, and then cool them as soon as possible after harvest. It's always a good practice to keep non-root crops away from root crops during harvest. And as you're harvesting non-root crops, very important to make sure that harvest containers are clean and that they're handled properly so that you reduce the possibility of cross-contamination from this point on. When thinking about harvest containers for crops, choose those containers that are easy to clean and sanitize. So containers that are made out of hard plastic are excellent. If we look at the examples here in this particular slide, the upper picture, these are harvest totes that are cardboard, but they're wax-covered cardboard. So that's better than just plain cardboard. And if we look at the lower picture, that plastic tote, this is an excellent example of a harvest container. And harvest containers should be clean as you go out to harvest, and they should be cleaned and sanitized on a regular schedule. Now, what should that schedule be? Well, again, it depends. If you're harvesting a crop that just naturally generates ooze and that sort of thing, like zucchini, for example, those harvest totes may need to be cleaned daily. If you're harvesting a crop that is less likely to contaminate a tote, it may not need to be that frequently. But a farmer is expected to assess the condition of harvest containers and to clean and sanitize any that are in a unsanitary condition. Now, once the crop is harvested, it's typically brought into an area for handling, sorting, grading, and then perhaps refrigerating. And certainly a pack shed can be a contained, enclosed environment, but you can also develop open situations that are perfectly suitable for the handling of produce. And we see some examples in these pictures here. The important thing is that containers that are being used can be easily cleaned and sanitized, that surfaces can be cleaned and sanitized, that the water that is being used at this point is potable, and that the people involved are practicing good health and hygiene practices. Make sure that surfaces in coolers and pack houses can be easily cleaned and sanitized. So in other words, they should be smoothed and cleanable. And looking at this particular picture, this is a cooler, and it was finished with PVC panels. And this gave us a very nice smooth surface. It's a PVC surface that doesn't provide harborage for bacteria or other organisms. It's easy to wipe this down and to spray it with a sanitizer. Some more examples of pack sheds that could be suitable. And if we look at these pack areas, we can notice some good things and perhaps some things that might need to be changed. Looking at the upper picture, we see stainless steel tables and hard plastic tables. These are excellent surfaces for handling produce because it's easy to clean and sanitize those surfaces. Looking at the lower picture, we see a 3-bay sink, which is great. It's a stainless steel sink. We also see water sources that are suspended so they don't come into contact with potential contaminating surfaces. But if we look behind, we notice some tables there that are built out of wood with a screen on for initial handling of produce. And this is a surface that is difficult to clean. There are lots of places for bacteria to lodge in a surface like this. So advice to this farmer might be to replace those tables at some point with a surface that is easier to clean and sanitize. And again, a simple example of a wash stand. We don't have to buy expensive equipment to make it suitable from the standpoint of produce food safety. Now, when we think about cleaning and sanitizing surfaces at harvest and post-harvest, it can be useful to think about zones. And zone 1 is the surface that contacts our produce. These are considered to be direct food contact surfaces. These are the most important surfaces from the standpoint of cleaning and sanitizing. Zone 2 surfaces are areas that reasonably could be expected to contact produce at some point, but not routinely. Zone 3 would be the floor, or perhaps the inside walls of this pack house, and Zone 4 would be the area outside of the pack house. Now, from the standpoint of risk management, most of our attention needs to go to Zone 1 and Zone 2, but also a focus on keeping Zone 3 and Zone 4 in a clean and sanitary condition can be very helpful to keep problems from moving into Zone 1 and Zone 2. Now, turning our attention to washing and cooling, if you don't have to wash produce, don't wash it. And in fact, some produce it's better not to wash. Produce such as tomatoes, berries, green bean, cabbages, other cole crops, peas, and peppers, frequently, if they're handled properly, come in from the field in a clean condition, and it's not necessary to wash them. Anytime you can remove a wash step from the process, you remove risk. If you do wash, you need to do it properly, because again, improper washing can take a small problem and spread it to large quantities of produce. If we look at this picture here, we notice those large tanks that are being used for produce. If we inadvertently have several contaminated pieces of produce in one of these tanks, and then we put clean produce in with it, the problem on the contaminated produce can quickly spread on the water to all of the produce in that tank. So again, if we don't need to wash, let's not wash. If we do need to wash, let's do it properly. Some produce items benefit from washing, and a good example is leafy greens. There's lots of places for debris to be accumulated in leafy greens. You can also improve quality by washing leafy greens. Now, how do we properly wash? First of all, of course, make sure that the surfaces that will contact produce, the insides of sinks, tables for placing produce on, can be cleaned and sanitized. Make sure that all water used in washing is potable water. If possible, use water once. In other words, develop a system where that water contacts one batch of produce and then it drains away. It's not reused. This is called single pass water. It is an excellent, good agricultural practice to minimize contamination risk. If we're using water more than once, then we might consider using a sanitizer in that water. That's called batch water or multiple use water. And in that case, the use of a sanitizer can help reduce problems related to cross-contamination. And then again, make sure that all packing containers are clean. Make sure that the harvest containers you take out to the field are clean. Make sure that the containers you pack into after handling and washing are clean. Those containers that either go to market or go into the cooler are clean. And then as we transport produce from the field to the pack house or from the pack house to the market, it's important to think about both safety and quality. You want to do this quickly. You want to allow for airflow between containers. If you're cooling produce, do it as quick as possible after harvest. This helps maintain quality. And with many organisms that cause foodborne illness, immediate cooling slows down the period of time during which these organisms can multiply and become a problem. Maintain the cold chain. If you cool produce, as you move it from the cooler to the market, maintain it in a cool situation. Shade your vehicles whenever possible. Again, this picture shows an example of the Cool Cat, which is an example of a mobile refrigerated unit that can be used to transport produce from a cooler to a market. And the plans to build these are available from several different sources. Make sure that anything that you transport in can be clean and sanitized. So for example, if you're using a pickup truck, as we see here, that has an unlined bed, and if we also use that pickup truck to transport animals or to haul manure or other amendments, make sure that we can clean and sanitize that pickup truck before we use it to transport produce. Now, if we have concerns about this, we can line the bed of a transport vehicle, a truck or a wagon, with a tarp or with some other surface that can be cleaned and sanitized. And then it's important to cover produce as we move it from the farm to the market, because there can be windblown issues that can descend upon produce in transit. It's also helpful to cover produce to maintain the cold chain and to keep it in a fresh condition when it arrives at market. Okay, do we have any questions on harvest and post-harvest handling?
I would say, just for clarification, we do a lot of transporting with our Suzu, taking food over to Cox South Hospital and for our produce distributions. Am I correct in saying that with every time we do that, if we have in between moved compost, it makes sense we'll need to rinse out? And do we also sanitize the bed before we put the boxes of produce in their plastic containers in the bed of the truck?
Yes, it's a good practice to both clean and sanitize. Cleaning, of course, removes what you can see. Sanitizing removes what you can't see. And so it's a good practice to just have that as part of the process. Now, if there's a concern about timeliness or other concerns, the bed of the Isuzu could be lined with a clean tarp, and then you could place boxes of produce on that tarp, and that would be an acceptable way to reduce the risk of cross-contamination.
And with sanitizing, whether sanitizing the tarp or sanitizing the bed of the Isuzu, excuse me, is there a way to like mix up something as a liquid in a bucket and use that, or do you use like a spray bottle? What's the best way to sanitize for that big of area?
The best way to apply a sanitizer, again, depends upon the characteristics of the surface that you want to sanitize. In the setting you're describing, I would mix up a sanitizer solution, put it into a pump-up sprayer, and then once I'm done cleaning, I would then spray down the surfaces with the pump-up sprayer, and that would be a dedicated pump-up sprayer just for sanitizing. And through that approach, you will get the you'll be able to thoroughly cover the surface with the sanitizing solution.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk a bit about people, because certainly the hands that contact produce can be a source of contamination, and good agricultural practices demand that we understand health and hygiene. Again, improper health and hygiene practices, things such as the lack of adequate training from the standpoint of health and hygiene, the lack of adequate hand washing practices, inadequate toilet facilities, or people handling produce if they are ill, all of these can contribute to foodborne illness. So again, any bodily fluid, there should be no bodily fluids contacting produce, and this applies to sneezing, coughing, as well as things such as diarrhea and vomiting. And it's very important that anyone who's going to be contacting produce be trained on this aspect. So, everyone who's going to contact produce, the farmers, volunteers, people at the market, all these folks need to be trained on health and hygiene. Very important to have accessible, clean, and stocked bathrooms. And it's important to have on-hand hand washing sites. And a hand washing site doesn't have to be elaborate, and it doesn't have to be expensive. All you need is potable water, soap, and single-use towels, and then a place to dispose of the rinse water and a place to dispose of the towels. Very important to train people on the proper hand washing procedure. And again, 20 seconds, and then thoroughly covering all of their hands up into their wrists, making sure nail beds are clean, making sure that that entire hands are covered during the hand washing process. And again, some examples of very straightforward, very simple hand washing stations set up near a porta potty. What we can't see here is that there is a basin below the faucet that collects the water, and then there is a paper towel dispenser off to the side. And again, just to reinforce the importance of proper hand washing technique. Now, the final thing related to produce food safety is record keeping, and there are a number of records that farmers are required to keep to satisfy the requirements of the produce safety rule. Others are just good agricultural practices. Record keeping is important because it obviously documents what you've done. It's helpful for monitoring. It's a place to go when you plan ahead for changes on a farm. It's also an effective tool for use in corrective actions to help keep problems from reoccurring. Lots of templates are available. Record keeping should be convenient. There needs to be a designated person in charge of record keeping, and you should keep records for at least 2 years, and perhaps even longer for records such as what the reports on water tests. And then a good place to put all of this information, to put records, to put information on good agricultural practices relative to produce food safety, is a farm food safety plan. It gets you thinking about your farm, keeps you organized, it gives you a plan to follow, documents progress, may be required to comply with regulations or laws. And it's just, again, just a good general idea from the standpoint of good agricultural practices. And we'll have a workshop coming up in the future on developing an on-farm food safety plan. There's lots of sources of information on produce food safety. Kansas State University has a number of excellent resources on their website, and Missouri shares a state produce food safety specialist with Kansas, and so the resources that are available in Kansas are equally applicable to Missouri. Cornell University sponsors the Produce Safety Alliance and some excellent resources on their website. If you're interested in regulations, the Food and Drug Administration's website discusses that. And then there's a number of other resources related to watershed design and harvest and post-harvest handling available through Iowa State University and the University of Vermont. Do we have any questions on good agricultural practices and produce food safety?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, very good. Well, let's turn our attention now to good agricultural practices and pesticide use. And again, I've summarized points from half-day trainings that we conduct relative to safe pesticide use. And so we'll go through this fairly quickly. There'll be a video that we'll watch relative to personal protective equipment. And again, plenty of opportunity for any questions, so please ask them as we go through this material. We're going to focus on pesticides in the environment, because really when pesticides are used on the farm, they do carry risk relative to the environment. They also carry risk relative to the applicator, and we'll be talking about the applicator here in just a moment. So again, recognizing that the environment on our farm is certainly the farm, but it's also the area around our farm, and we want to be concerned about how our use of pesticides impacts the environment both on our farm and the areas around our farm. Again, so the air we breathe, the water we drink is impacted by pesticide usage. And our surrounding wildlife is certainly impacted, both plants and animals. And again, recognize when I say pesticides, I'm thinking organic pesticides as well. And many of the organic pesticides carry the same risks that inorganic pesticides do. They have to be used properly to minimize these risks. Good agricultural practices must be followed. And since many of our farms are located close to urban areas, close to places where people are, it becomes doubly important that we recognize the importance of good agricultural practices when we use pesticides. It's important to recognize that our pesticide use on farm can impact lots of people that are around our farm. So again, we'll go through this fairly quickly, but what happens to pesticides once we've introduced them into the environment, once we've applied them to a crop area, what happens to them? Well, generally one of three things. They can be absorbed in the environment, they can be degraded, or they can be transferred, and we'll go through these different fates. So if they're absorbed, they can be actually bound to soil particles, and this can have a negative effect on soil life. And in fact, there have been a number of studies coming out recently on the negative impact of herbicide use on soil life. And frequently this is because these pesticides can actually bind to soil particles and cause issues for the life in the soil. Some of the factors that might affect absorption to soil particles, the texture of the soil. Typically fine soils will absorb more of pesticides than more coarse textured soils. Moist soils tend to absorb less than drier soils. Soil pH can have an impact, and the characteristics of the pesticide itself. So again, soils with fine textures have more binding sites, and wet soils absorb less pesticide because water molecules actually compete with pesticides for these binding sites. The second situation that might occur is transfer. We can actually see movement of the pesticide away from the target where we've put it, and this can have negative impacts on the farm as well, in the farm environment. And these transfer processes could be volatilization, it could be drift, runoff, leaching, absorption, or crop removal. We'll talk about each of these here briefly. So volatilization is when a pesticide that we've applied is converted to a solid and then leaves the area where we applied it, or a liquid. The solid or the liquid converts to a gas, and then it leaves the area for which we apply it. We may have applied it to a plant, but then it can be converted to a solid and it can drop from the plant. Or what is particularly tricky is it can be converted to a gas, and that can then be lost to the area around the plant, and it can move to non-target areas and cause serious issues. So again, spray drift, this is the movement of pesticides by air. And typically we're not going to be applying pesticides as we see here, but frequently when we do apply pesticides, even organic pesticides to crops, they're applied as a mist or as a droplet. And so there is the possibility for drift to non-target areas. And we want to be thinking about good agricultural practices that can help manage this situation. And some of the practices that'll help here, applying pesticides when there's little risk of wind movement, and using a fairly coarse droplet size to make sure that the pesticide reaches the target. Yeah, again, here are the factors that influence spray drift. The more windier it is, of course, the more likely you are to have spray drift. The higher the boom height, the more likely, the higher the spray pressure, and the smaller the particle size. Runoff can be a problem, and particularly if we've applied a pesticide and then we have a heavy rain situation, we can have runoff carrying pesticides either in the water itself or the pesticides that have been bound onto soil. Soil particles can, as soils erode, they also carry pesticides with them. So again, we want to think about good agricultural practices to minimize this particular risk. Some of the factors that can lead to issues with runoff: slope, particularly steep slopes, are more prone to soil loss and water runoff. Soil conditions, which primarily what we're talking about here is soils that are compacted or otherwise have structures that have been impaired that keep water from moving into the soil. Rainfall or irrigation, obviously if we have a heavy rainfall event or if we over-irrigate, we can have issues with runoff. And then a particularly important area is coverage on the soil. So coverage on the soil, particularly mulches or cover crops, can reduce the risk of runoff, can significantly reduce the risk of the movement of pesticides away from target areas. Here's an example that I picked up just to show you how pesticide runoff can sometimes be obvious. If we notice here, a herbicide was applied around these trees, and then there was a rainfall event that moved that herbicide away from the target area, and you can see the dead zones that resulted. And again, common sense. Don't apply pesticides immediately before a storm. Again, it's likely that what you apply on the crop is going to be lost one form or another, and that pesticide will then leave the target area. Buffer strips around water sources can help reduce the movement of pesticides into those water sources. And this can be helpful too from the standpoint of managing pesticide runoff. Leaching, this is the movement of pesticides into water sources within the soil. And again, some pesticides are very prone to this. Thankfully, most organic pesticides, this is not an issue, but unfortunately, we're reaping the legacy of the use of these pesticides over the decades that have now contaminated groundwater sources. So we want to be very conscious about ways that we can reduce the leaching of pesticides through the soil. And many pesticides will carry information on what can be done to reduce the risk of contamination through leaching. Absorption, this is when the pesticides actually move into plants and animals. And in some cases, this is intended. There are some pesticides that are systemic, that they actually enter into plants or animals. And that's part of their mode of action. Again, most organic pesticides, this is not the case. Most organic pesticides act as a surface or a topical application. And then another way that pesticides can be removed is by crop removal. And again, if pesticides have been used too close to harvest, they can actually be removed with the crop, and then they become a potential risk factor for the standpoint of the people who will be consuming those pesticides. Now, keep in mind that the pesticide label will have very specific information on what's called the pre-harvest interval. And this is the period of time that must elapse between the application of a pesticide and the harvest of the crop that was contacted with that pesticide. If you harvest in a shorter interval of time, there's a likelihood that the crop will carry with it unsafe pesticide residues. And again, this applies to organic pesticides as well as to inorganic pesticides. And then we have degradation in the environment. And this could be microbial degradation in the soil, it could be chemical degradation, or it could be photodegradation. Microbial degradation, many pesticides, particularly organic pesticides, are actually degraded by microorganisms. And this is one of the benefits of a vibrant, healthy soil, is that we have organisms there that can actually degrade and reduce the risk that is posed by pesticides that contact the soil. Chemical degradation, again, there can be processes, particularly in the soil, that degrade pesticides, again, just based upon the chemistry of the soil that breaks down pesticides. And then we can have photo degradation. Again, this sunlight is a very potent degrading agent for many pesticides. And unfortunately, with many organic pesticides, they quickly photodegrade. And this is one of the reasons that in many cases with organic pesticides, we must apply these pesticides at frequent intervals to see the benefit. It's because they do photodegrade. So for more information on pesticides in the environment, University of Missouri has developed a number of guides, and here is one. This is MU Guide 7520, Pesticides and the Environment. So check that out. It's available online as well as in hard copy. Now let's talk just for a brief moment about the safe and proper use of pesticides. And I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail here because we're actually going to have a workshop coming up on the safe use of organic pesticides. So we'll go into that topic in much more detail. But from the standpoint of good agricultural practices, it's important to understand some fundamental principles. Recognize that before using a pesticide, it's very important that there be a justification for that pesticide. And here's where we bring in the concept of integrated pest management. And we've actually conducted several workshops on integrated pest management, or IPM, for Springfield Community Gardens. And I would suggest that anyone who wants more information on this, take a look at one of our recordings from those workshops. And again, we go into a great amount of detail on what IPM is and how a farmer can develop an IPM strategy for a crop. And one of the tools that might be used as part of that IPM strategy is an organic pesticide. Always remember that the pesticide label governs the legal use of that pesticide. Here we see a label for the organic pesticide Pyganic. And before using Pyganic, it's very important that the farmer consult that label to read the entire label and to understand things such as the precautions and restrictions to using that pesticide, the directions for properly and safely applying that pesticide, personal protective equipment and first aid, environmental hazards posed by the use of this particular pesticide, and then safe ways to store the pesticide and to dispose of unwanted pesticide or empty pesticide containers. Again, more information on understanding pesticide labels is available in the MU Guide G1911. Now, when we think about protecting ourselves, and we've talked about protecting the environment, of course, but we also need to be thinking about protecting ourselves as applicators. And it's important to recognize that pesticides pose multiple risks to the person using them. And this, again, applies to organic pesticides as well. There can be issues related to exposure through your skin. This is called dermal contact. Pesticides that enter the mouth can be ingested, and this poses a risk. Breathing in pesticides, this is respiratory, can be a problem. And there's also the risk of pesticides entering the body through the eyes. So when we think about all these potential exposure risks, we want to be thinking about ways that we can protect the person who is using the pesticide. Now, pesticides pose the greatest risk when they're in their concentrated form. So if we look at this gentleman who's about to pick up a container that's spilled, this is definitely a risky situation because this pesticide is in its concentrated form. Once the pesticide has been diluted and we're applying it to the crop, there are still risks at this point, but the risk is less because the pesticide has been diluted. Remember, it's always the dose that poses the risk, and the higher the concentration, the higher the risk. Now, when we think about dermal entry, this is frequently the most common way that people are exposed to pesticides. And we recognize the different parts of the body take in pesticides at different rates. And if we look at this table that was developed looking at body regions and relative absorption of pesticides, we notice that, for example, the forearm, we tend to have a fairly low level of absorption through the forearm. But if we look at parts of the body such as the scalp or the forehead, it's much higher. And if we look at the genitalia, it can be extremely high. So again, different parts of the body pose different risks. And when we think about protection from accidental exposure to pesticides, we want to pay particular attention to protecting those parts of the body that pose the highest risk. Personal protective equipment is equipment that we wear as we're mixing and applying pesticides. This is equipment that's designed to keep us safe. I'll be the first to tell you that this equipment can be cumbersome and uncomfortable. But it's critically important that we as farmers recognize the risks the pesticides pose and that we protect ourselves from those risks. And personal protective equipment is a way to do that. The label will include specific information on personal protective equipment. Read the label, understand what's required. We're going to be taking a quick look at a video now. And this video was actually developed not with a insecticide or fungicide or a herbicide in mind. It was developed with sanitizing agents in mind. But sanitizers are regulated in the same way that other pesticides are. And so the information is the same from the standpoint of protecting yourself from an insecticide or a herbicide. So let's take a quick look at this video and then we'll see if there are any questions following it.
The sanitizer label includes information on personal protective equipment, or PPE. This is equipment that is designed to keep the people who are using the sanitizers safe. There may be scenarios, for example, people who are using the sanitizer in an undiluted form during mixing, loading, or otherwise handling the sanitizer may have more stringent PPE requirements than those who are using the diluted product. In the case of this particular product, handlers who may be exposed to the undiluted product must wear coveralls over a long-sleeve shirt and long pants, rubber gloves, chemical-resistant footwear plus socks, and protective eyewear, goggles or a face shield. The sanitizer label that we just consulted required the use of chemical-resistant coveralls over a long-sleeve shirt and long pants, the use of chemical-resistant gloves, non-absorbent footwear, and also a face shield or goggles. So let's go ahead and don our protective equipment. We'll first start by putting on the chemical-resistant coveralls. We'll next put on our chemical-resistant boots. There's also a requirement to wear socks. Make sure that the cuffs of the coveralls go over the boots. We'll place our face shield in front of our eyes, and then we'll don our chemical-resistant gloves. We now have in place all of the personal protective equipment that is needed to comply with the label. But most importantly, we now have the protective equipment on that will keep us safe when using the sanitizer in its undiluted form.
Okay, do we have any questions about that particular demonstration of personal protective equipment?
In the chat right now, it's not specifically about the personal protective equipment, but it is about the difference between adsorption and absorption with the AD preface versus the AB preface.
Well, there's not a lot of difference from the standpoint of the actual fate of the pesticide. Again, it just depends upon what it's uniting with relative to using the term ab versus adsorption.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to point out two other pieces of personal protective equipment, and these are respirators and goggles. And these are particularly important for the person who is actually applying the pesticide. Goggles, of course, are intended to protect the eyes. Wearing a face shield is pretty cumbersome when you're actually on the farm in produce fields. So goggles are typically the way that you protect your eyes from exposure. And the goggles should be vented, especially if you're wearing glasses. Otherwise, your glasses will fog up through using pesticide goggles, so they should be vented. The respirator is designed to protect you from the inhalation of pesticides. And the respirator that we see in this picture here has several components. The face shield of the respirator, there's a cup there that fits around your face, and it's intended that form an airtight seal. So in other words, if you have facial hair, it can be a challenge to wear a respirator properly. The canisters that we see on there are in two parts. One part is a pad filter. That's typically on the outside. That catches dust-borne or dust-sized particulates. And then the second part of the canister is an activated charcoal canister that catches vapors. And so if the pesticide respirator is used properly, it protects you from the inhalation of dusts and many pesticide vapors. Now, if we look at this individual who is spraying a pesticide on his lawn, we can immediately see some problems here. First of all, he is not protecting himself very well from dermal exposure. He has a short sleeve shirt on. He has cotton trousers on that are absorbent, and if he were to contact his trousers with this spray, it would be held against his legs. Same thing could be said for his shirt. His head is unprotected. Particularly his forehead, which, as we saw earlier, is a primary source of dermal absorption on the body. So again, this gentleman is definitely not following good agricultural practices from the standpoint of protecting himself from pesticide exposure. This person, on the other hand, is in much better shape. After applying pesticides, it's very important to decontaminate yourself, because even wearing protective equipment, it's likely that there is some level of contamination on your clothing and on your body. And so any clothing that is worn during pesticide mixing or application should be laundered with detergent, and should be laundered separately from other laundry. And then if possible, it should be hung out to dry on the line in the sun, because as I mentioned before, the sun is a very potent photodegrader of pesticides. So it can be helpful to hang these clothes up to dry on the line. There's more information on laundering pesticide-contaminated clothing in MU Guide G 1914. And then be sure to clean yourself after applying pesticides. It's a good idea to take a thorough shower, and then to clean the shower out after you've cleaned yourself off to decontaminate yourself. Okay, do we have any questions relative to pesticide use and good agricultural practices to reduce environmental problems and to reduce health problems related to pesticides?
There's nothing else in the chat right now.
Okay, so the remainder of our workshop will be a video presentation, and this is focused on good agricultural practices as they relate to the physical and mental health of the farmer. And you know, we spent a lot of time talking about maintaining equipment and maintaining soil health and growing crops and doing a good job of marketing crops, but the bottom line is we oftentimes don't take good enough care of ourselves. And it's critically important that we focus on our physical and mental health as farmers if we're going to be an effective part of the food system. Okay, it's just so important that we take care of ourselves as well as our farms. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at this video and learning more about ways that we can do that. I do want to thank the team that put this video together, and these include Karen Funkenbush, who is our state specialist on agribility, Brenda Schreck, who is an extension specialist, and then two specialists from Lincoln University, David Middleton and Sean Bishop. So let's take a look at the video that they put together for us. And I'll have to jump around a bit because I didn't embed this video in the program. Deborah, can we see the video and hear the audio?
The audio is very faint, and I'm seeing where you clicked on the video, but not the actual video.
Okay, let me go back and reshare that. All right, can we see the video now, Deborah?
Yes, I can see it great.
Okay, excellent. Let me hide the meeting controls here. And if you don't mind, maybe just briefly break in and let me know if the audio is good.
It looks like there's some sort of black square. Oh, you got it away. There you go.
Okay.
Tool Talk for Health and Safety Management presentation.
How is the audio?
My name is Brenda
This is
Schreck.
good.
I'm a county
Thank you.
engagement specialist based in Lewis County, which is in the Northeast region. My partner today is Karen Bunkenbush. She is an MU Extension Specialist and State Director for Missouri Agribility. What is ergonomics? In front of you are several definitions of ergonomics, but the one that I like the best is the first one. Simply put, we are working smarter, not harder, by using tools that not only fit the job at hand, but also each one of us. Posture and balance. Who can stand on one leg? How about reaching way out in front of you like you were trying to reach the far side of your garden or your flower bed? Probably not very many of us, safely that is. It is important to keep your body in balance in order to reduce overall body fatigue as well as aches and pains in your joints and muscles. Some things we can do in our gardens and flower beds to encourage good posture are using raised beds, containers, and even trellises. Idea being that you are bringing the garden closer to you. Ideally, the garden or flower bed would be about waist level because the less bending and strain put on your back, the better. If raised beds or containers are not an option, you can simply purchase or modify garden tools to be more ergonomically friendly. We're going to take a short break from our presentation to show you this quick video from our colleague David Middleton, who is the farm outreach worker for the Southwest region at Lincoln University Cooperative Extension. He will introduce many of the topics that Karen and I will discuss in the remainder of our presentation.
Hello, I'm David Middleton. I'm with Lincoln University, the Small Farm Program here in Southwest Missouri, and today we want to talk about some ergonomics and how to kind of save your body, because we know that when we get into raising vegetables and doing this sort of work, it's a lot of physical work. And so some of the tips I want to give you today are pretty simple. When we talk about getting ready to work, we need to do some stretching. We need to do some loosening up. When you think about how the football players come out in the second half at high school, they all do a little bit of loosening up. They even warm up horses before a race. So we want to warm up and kind of get our bodies all limbered up so that we can do some moving around and not really put a lot of stress on our body. So, you know, some knee bends, some stretches, whatever kind of helps you to work. And then we want to get into how we handle some tools. Now, one of the things we work with a lot are these little spades. And a lot of times people want to grab them like this. And that's wrong on your wrist. If we hold them like this, and there is actually a thumb print right here for your thumb to go in and keeps your hand straight. And when we dig, we don't put all the stress and strain on our wrist and on our forearms. Now, sometimes, yes, we want to do this, we want to get in deep and dig, but most of the time we want to hold it just like this for the straightener right here. When we work with long-handled tools, one of the things that we can always do to see if we find the right size tool is do this. This is the perfect size to fit your hand. So if you have something larger than what will go here, it doesn't give you the right grip. And some things that we can do, we can add a pistol grip, which actually helps us work easier, and it keeps our wings in instead of being out here and all bent over. Every time that we work, if we keep our elbows closer to our body and work closer around, we don't put the stress on our bodies. So what happens if we've got something that is smaller than this? We use the right glove. And so there's a glove for every purpose. There may be something that's just to general work, all the way to anti-vibration gloves. And these, if you notice, these gloves have different padding on them to save your hands right here where you grip, also back on your knuckles, so when you bump that you don't get all the damage on your hands. So we want to make sure that we have the right glove for the right application for whatever we're doing in our gardening. When we talk about ergonomics and different tools, we want to make sure that what we're buying fits us. Most all tools are made for a man's hand. If you're female, your hand is much smaller, and so you want to be sure you're trying out these tools when you purchase them and make them fit your body. Now, both of these shovels that I have here are considered ergonomic because they've got the ends on them. This also has a grip on it. But here's something that's very interesting. When we look at them, we see that the neck on them is different. This one has a different flatness on the neck as compared to this one. So when you use this one, you're bending lower to use it. When you're using this one, you're more apt to stand up and not put the stress on your back. So just be sure and try your tools out before you buy them when you're in the store, and look for what fits your body best. When we get into doing a lot of planting, harvesting, whatever we're doing down on the ground, crawling around sometimes is hard for us to do. So this little tool right here that doesn't cost but about $10 actually gives us a way to get down on the ground, not be flat on our knees, save some knee problems from not being on a rock or a hard surface. And then when we want to get up, it actually helps us to stand. The other thing about it, we get tired, we have a place to rest. Maybe work at a different height here as we're pruning or whatever. There are other tools that are available to help us move around, such as small carts, and just making sure that we don't put stress on our bodies so we can continue doing what we love for a long time in life.
To add to David's comments about tools fitting your hand, there are several concepts that make a garden tool ergonomically friendly. Your tools should keep your wrists in a neutral or natural position to lessen the amount of stress on joints, and it allows you to work longer and exert less energy. The tools should have large, soft handles that are textured or have a non-slip material to allow for a better grip on the tool. Finally, the tool should have a depression or ridge on the top of the tool for your thumb to rest against, to keep your hand and wrist in that neutral or natural position. So what do we mean by our hand and wrist being in a natural or neutral position? Observe your hand and wrist when you have them completely relaxed at your sides. What does that look like? Your wrist is straight. Your hand is rotated to a relaxed position. Your fingers are slightly curled and at rest. Your thumb is likely straight and again relaxed. This natural or neutral position should be maintained as much as possible to decrease the amount of strain you put on your body while working in your garden or flower bed. To help us maintain a neutral position, take the time while you are shopping for new tools to try them on. There are 3 concepts to keep in mind. First is the handle length. It should be the length of your hand from the tip of your finger to the bottom of the palm of your hand. Second is the diameter of the handle. It should be no bigger than the circle made when you put your index finger and thumb together. The tool should have a thumb indicator. As we just mentioned, the indicator helps your wrist to keep in that neutral position. For long-handled tools, the same diameter is recommended and the handle should be as tall as you are. This should allow for the handle to be long enough for you to remain upright and not put a strain on your back from bending over. As David mentioned in his video, the curve of the handle and the soft padding can also play an important part in selecting the most ergonomically friendly long-handled tool. Take a look at the various garden trowel options in front of you. Do any of them have some of the concepts that we have been talking about? Most of them do. Even the yellow 99-cent shovel has a textured handle as well as a black thumb indicator. This shows you that if your budget is tight Or maybe you only have a tiny garden so far that you don't have to go buy the most expensive shovel to get a tool that is ergonomically friendly. Probably the least ergonomically friendly appearing shovel is the wooden-handled $4.50 shovel. The handle is not soft, not textured, nor does it have a thumb indicator. If I had to select the most ergonomically friendly appearing, I'd say it is the $7 red-handled trowel. It hits all the factors that we have discussed on the last slide. It has a large, soft, textured, non-slip handle with a very defined thumb indicator. It even has a guard to help prevent your hand from sliding down into the metal portion of the shovel. As you stand in the aisle at the farm store studying the various tools, remember to test the handles for their length, diameter, and a thumb indicator. This set of tools goes back to our conversation we had earlier about posture and balance, as well as David's video. By extending our reach, it provides us with more or better leverage, as well as reducing the amount of strain we put on our backs. For further information about choosing the best tool for the job, how to make doing chores easier, or how to modify the tools you already own into more ergonomically friendly tools, be sure to check out our handout called Growing for Life. Something to remember when selecting a pair of gloves is that it all depends on what you'll be doing and what kind of budget you have. For example, you probably do not need a $30 pair of chainsaw gloves made from Kevlar that are vibration resistant. But maybe your job requires something a little tougher or better quality than a $4 pair of cloth gloves. So what does make for a good glove? Number 1, balance of comfort and durability. A happy medium glove would be one that is durable yet pliable, that protects your hands while letting you maneuver. 2, reinforced fingertips, usually the first part of the glove to fail. 3, double stitch seams. 4, wrist closure, that helps keep out the debris. 5, glove fit. Best fit is one that is snug but not too tight. Your fingers should be near the end of the fingertips. Webbing between your fingers should fit snugly, and the wrist closure should sit at the wrist. 6, flexibility. Your gloves should flex with your every move. Can you make a fist? Can you spread your fingers out? Can you grasp things between your finger and your thumb? 7, padding and protection. Are your knuckles, palms, and webbing between your thumb and index finger protected? 8, material. Can range from cotton to leather or even knit, but the type of material all depends on what you'll be using the gloves for. Like David mentioned in his video, you have to save your knees. No doubt if I took a poll of everyone listening in today of who has had knee or back surgery, there would be several hands that go up. Best case scenario is that you never get down on your knees. However, if you do, again, work smarter, not harder. Be sure to have something with padding to help save your knees. While some of these tools may be out of your budget, even using an old rug or towel will be better than nothing to help reduce the strain on your knees and back.
Hello, my name is Karen Funkenbush, and as an MU Extension Specialist and State Director for Missouri Agribility, I will briefly discuss mental and physical stress and handy resources an individual can personally use or share with others to help lower their stress. During these unusual times, it's easy to neglect your physical and mental health. However, taking care of your personal health and well-being should be an everyday habit, just like selecting and maintaining your ergonomic garden tools that Brenda and David just talked about. I want to start the conversation out tonight by saying that not all stress is bad. A little bit of stress can help us stay focused, energetic, and able to meet any new challenges. It's what keeps us on our toes while physically tending our gardens, as well as staying alert to prevent accidents or costly mistakes. Short-lived feelings of behavioral stress are a regular part of our daily lives. However, with the physical effects of stress, it can adversely affect our physical well-being, thoughts, and actions. When stress exceeds our ability to cope, it stops being helpful and starts causing damage to our mind and body, as well as our satisfaction of tending the garden. As we all know, you can't control everything, but that doesn't mean you are powerless, even when you are stuck in a difficult situation. If stress is interfering with your physical and mental health, now is the time to take action. No matter what you do for a living or how stressful your life is, there are plenty of things that you can do to reduce your overall stress level and regain a sense of control. Investing in your physical and mental health should be no different than making an investment to buying and maintaining high-quality garden tools. There are a couple of ways that you can invest in your mental health to make it a habit of taking care of yourself during these stressful times. For example, talking to a family member or a trusted friend, especially face-to-face, can be one effective way of regaining your sense of calm. Another example is asking for help and the willingness to receive emotional support. Remember, you are not alone. If you or someone you know needs help, call the 1-800 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that is shown on our screen. The Lifeline provides 24/7 free and confidential support for people in distress, as well as offers prevention and crisis resources. Taking a 10-minute break for yourself every day is another healthy habit to help keep you alert, focused, and incident-free. Next, I would like to share a couple websites from the University of Missouri Extension, Missouri Department of Agriculture, and Missouri Department of Mental Health. If you go to these selected websites shown on this slide, you will find handy downloadable resources that will educate you about the ways to improve your overall mental and physical health, as well as video clips, guide sheets, brochures, tip sheets, and informational publications about staying healthy and safe while tending your garden or working on the farm. If you have any questions about our MU Extension resources or would like more information about ergonomic tools for health and safety, please contact Brenda Schreck or Karen Funkenbush. Our contact information is located on the last slide. The first website that I would like to talk about is the Show Me Strong Farm Families. This website is set up to address the mental health crisis in rural areas. MU Extension has compiled mental health resources for consumers and professionals. Resources include links to Missouri social service agencies, hotlines, and help organizations. If you have any questions about the resources or need additional mental health information, please contact Karen Funkenbush, MU Extension State Director, at 1-800-995-8503. The second resource I would like to talk about is the Show Me Strong Farm Family Facebook. The University of Missouri maintains this Facebook page that provides daily updates, weekly announcements, resources, tips, programs, and information for farm families, rural communities, and stakeholders about mental health and suicide prevention. The next resource that I would like to talk about is the MU Extension Missouri Agribility Project. This website provides participants with a one-stop shop of rural health, safety, wellness, prevention of secondary injuries, educational resources, and smart technologies for farmers with disabilities and their families. The program links MU and Lincoln University Extension Services with a not-for-profit disability organization to provide practical education and on-the-farm assistance that promotes agricultural and rural independence. If you have any questions about the resources or need additional information about Missouri Agribility, please contact Karen Funkenbush, MU Extension State Director, at 1-800-995-8503. This website represents a committee of stakeholders who are invested in protecting our futures through farm safety and health. Show Me Farm Safety aims to reduce injuries and fatalities that occur on the farm by providing educational resources, tips, and safety plans to producers and their families. This website is maintained by the Missouri Department of Agriculture. The last website I would like to talk about is the Missouri Department of Mental Health. If participants are looking for coping, mental health, substance abuse, disaster preparedness, or links to helplines, they should definitely check out this website. To quickly recap, I'd like you to remember these 5 points. Number 1, taking care of your personal health and well-being should become an everyday habit. Number 2, if stress is interfering with your physical or mental health, now is the time to take action. Number 3, no matter what you do for a living or how stressful your life is, there are plenty of things that you can do to reduce your overall stress levels, and resources are available to help you regain a sense of control. Number 4, as Brenda and David indicated, good basic ergonomics while gardening should include keeping the workload close to you, taking frequent breaks to rest, using proper tools, and maintaining neutral positions whenever possible. Number 5, they also indicated that selecting the right ergonomic tools and using them correctly can help make garden chores easier and safer, which leads to overall good health and safety best management practices. I'll finish up by saying that my colleagues and I thanked Patrick Byers for this opportunity to present and appreciate your attention to our presentation.
Okay, very good. Well, let me go ahead and return to our presentation. Okay, do we have any questions related to the video that we just watched?
There are none in the chat right now.
Okay, well, again, I want to thank Karen and Brenda and the team for putting that together for our workshop tonight. Much appreciated. And again, please, any of those websites are available 24 hours a day. If anyone has any concerns, please reach out. There's help available for both physical and mental health issues here in Missouri. Okay, well, that is the material that I wanted to cover tonight. And I think at this point, if we want to unmute, let's just go ahead and have a conversation about the material that we covered tonight. Okay, Drew and Elizabeth, anything that you'd like to bring up that we could visit about?
Something that I was thinking about the the pest control section was really our only problem is at the market garden. We've got some neighborhood cats. I think a lot of strays like to come into our garden and use it as a litter box at times, and trying to figure out how to deal with that. Haven't really had a contamination issue yet, but it is annoying and it is a concern. So are you aware of any like products or methods of deterring stray cats that is reliable? Or
That's a tough one, Drew. You know, it's not only a risk in the field, but they also like compost piles and other places as far as places to defecate. And then, you know, you have contamination, you don't even know it. So it's a problem. And I've visited with several folks about that situation. We've not been able to come up with a good solution. I mean, it's not difficult to trap feral cats, but then you've got to decide what to do with the cats that you've trapped. And there's always a chance that you'll catch, you know, a neighbor's cat, and you know, you obviously don't want to use any sort of a removal situation with a local cat. So I'm afraid there's not a good answer to that, Drew. I mean, it could be possible on a small scale to exclude cats from produce areas, but again, they climb and they also dig under, and so that's not 100% effective either.
right. Okay.
Any other questions relative to the material that we covered tonight?
Drew, could you tell me what kind of sanitation that you guys use? Like, Patrick was talking about using a spray bottle and spraying things down. I've
Yeah.
never actually seen what you guys use before.
Currently at the market garden is where we do all of our washing and packing, and it's pretty rudimentary. Stand, over there by the shed. And so currently we're just using a soap, like a what is that? Like a biodegradable, natural soap because of the runoff. We don't have it going into any kind of drain right now. It's just all open, so it goes off down the sidewalk pretty much, and so we have to use that. And I think that setup kind of limits our ability to effectively use a lot of chemicals because of the runoff. Once we get the pack shed going, I think that's when we can step up our game. But that's a good point about the Isuzu. We do use that for many different things, and we've never really thought to sanitize it. I've taken it to the car wash a couple times, but not given it any kind of sanitizing treatment. I'm not quite sure what to use on that kind of scale for something like the Isuzu. I don't assume that Clorox would be, or maybe, I don't know.
Well, so some comments on that. What I see people using in that kind of a setting, again, it depends to some extent if the farm is certified organic. If it is certified organic, that does limit particularly the chlorine-based sanitizers, but there's still others that could be used. The ones that are typically used are based upon hydrogen peroxide or perchloric acid, so something like Sanidate or Tsunami. Those would be the ones that could be used. If you are comfortable using chlorine-based, you can get chlorine-based sanitizers that could be used for that. Now, it's important that the label state that it's used, can be used on food contact surfaces or on produce itself. And for example, not all Clorox labels read that way. Some do and others do not. So just check your label. If you need any suggestions on what to use, if you've got several things you're considering and you want an opinion, let me know and I'll be happy to weigh in on that.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Patrick.
Sure.
Patrick, I had a question about sanitizing bins, like harvest bins. Is there any, so if we wash a harvest bin and then set it in the shed, and then it stays there for a week or two, can we kind of assume the next time we use it that it's still clean, or is there a lifespan on once sanitization is done, how long you can consider it, clean?
Yeah. Well, let's think about where contamination comes from. If the shed where you've put it is, first of all, rodent tight, in other words, there's no way for mice or rats or other animals to get in there, that's a good point. Secondly, if you can store it up off the ground, that's very helpful. Put it on a plastic pallet or something like that. If you can exclude dust and that sort of windblown type issues from getting in there, that's good as well. If you can say yes to those points, then you can have long-term storage and not have to clean and sanitize when you bring those things out to use. That would also be a good setting in which to store disposable packaging like cardboard lugs or boxes or whatever, that sort of thing.
Okay.
I would say the biggest concern is related to rodents and flies.
Okay. Yeah, it's true. Are flies considered a source of cross contamination if they land on Dookie, then land on our crops? That's a contamination, right? Or
It is indeed. There have been lots of studies done on flies and what they can carry, and it's pretty scary.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you think about excluding flies, if you're in a pack house like the one that you'll have there at Fairbanks, screens on the windows and then some sort of screen door which can keep flies out is the place to start. But it's also helpful to have a fly trap or fly paper or some other way to physically catch any flies that do get inside.
Mhm.
Yeah, where it becomes an issue is when you're trying to pack out in the open and there's not really any way to exclude flies.
Right.
Okay, anything else we should talk about tonight? Anything at all?
I think we're good.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and Deborah, thanks for moderating.
Of course.
Again, as I've said several times, if anything comes up relative to the gardens or the Beginning Farmer program that you just want to bounce some ideas off, let me know, and